today I am speaking about a recent development in South Africa, where I live, where AI was introduced into the social grant system, and it's caused a bit of havoc. But before getting into that, I thought maybe I should just introduce myself a little bit about the work that I do and provide some context for me being here, or motivation. So I am a researcher at Research ICT Africa, which is a think tank based in Cape Town. And this is a photo of some of my colleagues looking really collegial. A few of them are on the call today, so that's really nice as well. And as a think tank, our aim is to facilitate the making of effective and evidence-informed policies that can help to bring about a more just digital future, or through digital technologies, a more just future, specifically for Africa. So it's very Africa-centric. And I guess just for some context, there's kind of no shortage of optimism in the world today about the potential that digital technologies have for development and for revolutionizing our solutions to some of the world's most pressing issues, including in education and healthcare. But what we found at RIA is that digital technologies similarly, or perhaps are more likely to deepen existing problems depending on how they're managed. So yeah, we're looking for evidence and information that can support better policies, basically. And it's through my work that I found out about the AI Inequality Summer School that happened a couple of months ago, which was really cool to attend for several reasons. But just one of them was that it was nice to place the work that I'm doing at RIA, which is more Africa focused, into this global context and to connect with people in the area from around the world in the AI space. And for our final assignment, we were asked to select one of the topics we had covered in the course to connect with our work or with our lives, and to write an essay about that. And I wasn't really sure where to start, but one of the standout papers that I had read, or we had read in the course, was this one screenshotted on the right called Against Predictive Optimization. And basically, so I'm going to go into what predictive optimization is just now, but just generally, it's using AI to make decisions. And in this paper, the authors, who are made up of 3 Princeton University researchers and 1 from Cornell University, they looked at 47 different examples of predictive optimization. And from these examples, they distilled 7 inherent flaws. And they conclude that we should think of predictive optimization as illegitimate by default in its use. And I was wondering, well, one thing I noticed is that there hadn't been any example of it from a developing world context in the paper. And another thing I was just wondering was if predictive optimization was being used in South Africa, or if it was affecting South Africans in any way, because that would make it closer to home. And it was a bittersweet realization to find out that it was. In June 26th, it was introduced into South Africa's social grant system. Sweet because I had a topic to write about, but bitter because the circumstance is pretty dire. And so that's what I would like to talk about today. I guess one thing that really did concern me was how no one was talking about it. And I'm also supposed to, I didn't even know about it. So yeah, I think that gives a good motivation to speak about it today. And my overview for the presentation is essentially just to answer these 4 questions, and in this order. I first want to just define what predictive optimization is, or at least how it was used in the paper that I draw from. I also want to just give some fast facts on the social relief of distress grant that it was introduced into, and then just to unpack why things went south. And finally, to conclude, more future-looking about how AI could be used more responsibly or ethically in South Africa's social wellness welfare, space. So what is predictive optimization? And I think that the easiest way to think about it is as being a solution to one of the world's, or one of humans' biggest challenges, which we can't really escape, and it's the challenge of making decisions. I know that there are several people or many people who are good at making decisions, but nobody actually enjoys having to make a decision. And if we had to kind of identify what it was about decision making that was uncomfortable and unbearable for many, is these two features. I think the one that they're made in a uncertain, based on uncertainty. So you're thinking about possible future events and deciding between those, but nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future. And the second big one is that you stand to lose something, or you stand to be worse off. And this could be worse off than what you are right now, or the same as how you are now, but worse off than you could have been if you had gone with a different option. And some decisions are really simple, like which flavor ice cream to order. But the worst decisions, or the hardest ones to make, are those that are based on really uncertain future events and that could affect the well-being of so many people. And these are decisions that are made in the social welfare system every day around the world. I don't envy any of those people who are charged with making those decisions, but I would say that they must be even harder in a resource-constrained context. So when you have less funding, less institutional capacity and support, and when the outcome of the decision could really be life or death for millions of people. So enter predictive optimization, which is super attractive from the outside. And it can be identified by having these three features. Firstly, it's this automated decision-making system. And it uses machine learning to make a forecast about how individuals will behave in the future. And then it uses those forecasts to inform decisions about how to treat those individuals. And it's sold by those who use it or those who make it as a really accurate way of making decisions. We often think of data as just pure facts or objective, and so AI can just take the facts and give us a good thing. And it is not going to benefit one person over another because of some emotional tie. It's also really efficient, not just because it's timely, because it can make a decision really quickly, but because I think it releases humans from the emotional burden of making these decisions. So that's one part of the stage that I want to set. And then the other part is the Social Relief of Distress Grant in South Africa, which was introduced after COVID to support adults who had their jobs compromised by the pandemic. So at the moment, there are 7.5 million recipients of this grant, and it's a monthly payment of 370 Rand, which is $20. And to be eligible to get the grant, you need to be between 18 and 59 years old. And you also need to be earning less than 624 Rands in a month. According to official records, Stats SA, the food poverty line in South Africa is 760 Rand. So just covering your basic food needs in a month before electricity and accommodation is 760 Rand. And honestly, I would actually, we do have an economist on the call. It would be interesting to know how they even come up with that stat. There are obviously different standards of living, different lifestyles in Cape Town, but I can't imagine living on that little money in a month. So there have been many benefits associated with the SRD grant for its kind of wider economic benefits. One of them is that it's associated with people looking for jobs and being successful and finding jobs. But the main purpose of the SRD grant is to pull people out of food poverty, or those people who are just on the cusp of it. And between 2020 and 2021, it prevented 2.8 million South Africans from falling into poverty, food poverty. And I think because of all these benefits, it's what was supposed to be a temporary measure after COVID has kind of stayed. But there are a lot of debates and disputes around the SRD grant, and one of them is that apparently there's a lot of people who are fraudulently acquiring the funds, and it is, I guess, good to highlight that even if you're fraudulently acquiring 370 rand, it reveals something quite desperate about your situation. Not that it makes it right, but it good thing to just keep in mind. So in this context, we kind of, now the stage is set, and it seems that predictive optimization and the SRD grant are like a match made in heaven. And SASA, who is responsible for issuing these grants, decided to use predictive optimization to detect fraud and to counter it. And more specifically, it was looking for the beneficiaries who were at risk of having their identities taken to get the funds, and also at people who might accidentally, people who would be fraudulently stealing identities. And what happened is that these people that AI detected as, I'm going to say gave them a red flag. These people got a link on their mobile phones, which they had to open, and then they had to take a selfie. And then the selfie was matched up against their identity photo held in government records. And if they matched, so using facial recognition, then the person would get their payment. But in the meantime, everyone's payment has been paused. And as a result, thousands have just not had their grant payment since. And this was in June 26, so that's several months without a lifeline fund. We actually don't know the real numbers, but according to Pay the Grants, which is a NGO that is kind of supporting those beneficiaries, they've had thousands of complaints so far. So we want to know kind of like, well, what went wrong, because everything looked like it was set up for success. And the main reason is a lack of meaningful connectivity on the continent, but also in South Africa. I actually think South Africa's connectivity is better than many other African nations. Generally, when you think about access, you could divide it into supply side constraints and demand side constraints. So a supply side constraint would be that there aren't any fiber optics laid in your area, or you don't have internet connection. But the sorts of things, technical infrastructures that the government might supply. And a demand side constraint to access would be when there is Wi-Fi, for example, but you can't access it because you can't afford it, or because you don't have a device, or because you have a device but you don't have digital literacy or literacy. Those are demand side constraints. And what we found at Research ICT Africa is that it's generally the demand side constraints that are prohibiting people from having meaningful connectivity. And by that, I mean that they could use these services productively. So just for some stats from a recent survey, is that 11% of unemployed South Africans don't have a cell phone. They, even those who have a cell phone, many of them don't have a smartphone. And 38% of South Africans don't have access to the internet. And another thing to kind of drive home that we've noticed is that digital exclusion tends to mimic patterns of historical exclusion. So people, it's generally at the intersection of different marginalized groups that the situation is worse. So if you're, for instance, a queer Black woman living in a rural area, then you're even less likely to have meaningful connectivity. This is a really long way of saying that from the outset, it was very likely that those same people who don't have meaningful connectivity are also beneficiaries of the SRD grant, who are the people who are at the very bottom of, oh, I don't want to say it like that, who are the most insecure economically in the country. And this is like a little screenshot from the media press from SASA when they started the system. They said to verify your identity, you need a smartphone or a computer and stable Wi-Fi. So when we compare those against the reality, it just seems that the decision taken by the government was not only inappropriate, but it was really negligent, and definitely something that could have been anticipated and prevented. But there were some beneficiaries who received the link, and they were really lucky because they could send through a verification selfie. And even these individuals had their attempt rejected and weren't able to access the funds. And this was because of the more supply side hiccups. So the facial recognition system couldn't match up different identities when the person didn't have a smart ID. So if you just have an ID book, then it couldn't match up the ID photo with your newly taken selfie. And for these people, it said, go and apply for a smart ID, which is costly and it takes a lot of time. So that's not a very good solution. And then another thing is just that the Department of Home Affairs system went down. So it didn't send a link to some people, but it had cut off their payment. So that was just a technical glitch. And again, not surprising in the context of South Africa. One of RIA's findings is that when you lay a technology over an existing inequality or over an existing problems, then it's just going to worsen the problem. But one might ask, okay, say in a hypothetical world where we made sure that all South Africans were meaningfully connected to the internet and everyone had their own smartphone and could verify their identity, and say Home Affairs was all like kitted out technologically, would there be any problems remaining with what happened? And the answer is that there are still problems that go deeper. So one of them is a complete lack of transparency about how they detected people who were vulnerable to fraud or to identity theft. We still haven't got any information about how SASA, which data it uses, or how the algorithm works to take this lifeline fund away from people. The only thing we have is from one of the spokespeople from SASA, who says that they work closely with banks and the South African Fraud Prevention Center, but that doesn't really help. And then another issue is how appropriate it is to be detecting fraud. I had mentioned in the beginning of the session that to fraudulently acquire 370 Rand says something about your situation, even if it isn't right. And it seems that this use of AI by the SASA government is trying to force a line between deserving poor people and undeserving poor people, which doesn't seem like a productive way to be going about things. Technically 16 million South Africans are actually eligible for the SRD, but it only goes to half of them. So a better priority, one would think, is to use AI to find out if the SRD grant is not going to people that it should be going to. Because if it fails there, then it's not making the situation worse. but if it succeeds, then it'll make a situation better. That leads into the next question about how AI could be put to better use in the system. And here are just some thoughts, but it would be nice to maybe discuss this more after the presentation. But one thing that seems essential is that the system is transparent. So everyone who is going to be affected by what's happening should know in advance that this is what the government is doing. And this is the data that they're using. This is how they'll identify people who could be vulnerable. We also want that the government can be held accountable, whoever is using the system, for any of these problems, which hasn't been the case for now. Apparently, only 1% of the beneficiaries who have spoken out and said, I've been wrongly had my fund taken away, only 1% of them have gotten their fund back. So it's not been the appeal system hasn't been successful. We also want that AI is responding to the specific context that it's being used in. And this would include making sure that there are analog options available. So in a situation like in South Africa, where not everybody has a mobile phone, you'd want that someone could go to a Home Affairs office somewhere close by to where they live to sort these issues out, and that things like their language are taken into consideration. And then another thing we found at RIA is that income and education are key determinants of or key drivers of digital access. And so any effort to use AI by the government should work with efforts to remedy structural existing inequalities. And a good place to start is in income and education. That's my presentation.